Today, I want to talk about a really cool study that examined our closest evolutionary relatives, which you might know to be the great apes. The researchers noticed that we, as humans, seem to be, on some level, able to intuitively understand many gestures and much of the body language of other primates, and maybe vice versa. This makes sense, as we're all quite closely related, and presumably had a common ancestor with deeply rooted neurological behavioral responses that could have been retained across its descendants. The findings of their study, which was published in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, suggest that all great apes could at one point in time communicate with each other. Some of the researchers, like Christy Graham, Richard Byrne, and Catherine Hobater, all PhDs, noticed that chimp hand gestures and body language coincided with a lot of bonobo hand gestures. Their recent research discovered that chimps and bonobos could actually communicate cross-species with gestures because they shared the same meanings behind these gestures. After hundreds of man-hours of observation, the researchers created a catalog of 33 bonobo gestures, and what they presumably meant, based on the response of nearby bonobos who acknowledged the gesture. This research largely replicates a catalog of chimpanzee gestures, which had been compiled previously. And it turns out that there's a huge overlap in gestures and meanings between individuals, groups, and species that might suggest that gestures, to some degree, are biologically inherited. She notes that language in human cultures is passed down not biologically but culturally, and two humans with different verbal language often struggle to communicate. Coincidentally, their best means of communication, if they couldn't understand each other verbally, would be hand gestures and body language. Now, if the primates had a culturally analogous form of body language, Dr. Graham says that this would be a, quote, more complicated explanation if all the gestures were learned but still meant the same thing for individuals in completely different groups and species, unquote. Therefore, this strongly implies a biological basis to this behavior. Further evidence for this biological basis can be found by looking at the more extended great ape family, like orangutans and gorillas, who share 80% and 60% respectively of the chimpanzee's gestures and body language. Follow-up research is intending to explore whether or not these shared gestures also share the same meanings, and thus imply a window of communication across the great ape family tree. Christy Graham and her fellow researchers are also looking into humans, and how accurate our perception of the body language of our primate cousins can be. They seek to understand how much human body language is shared, and how much meaning we can convey with our hands and our body language. It might seem crazy to think that we can look at a chimp or a bonobo and watch them make a hand gesture or some kind of body motion, and somehow intuitively feel like we might know what the chimp is saying. But it's even wilder to think that, on some deep evolutionary level, the chimp or the bonobo might be able to look back at us and understand our body language and our hand gestures. What if these primates understand us far better than we give them credit for? Because they're picking up on some very basal, very primitive signals, the ones we convey with our body language, our hand gestures, our eye movements, all things that are to some degree subconscious. So maybe the primates are able to use this shared basis of communication to look through a window into our minds and make their own thoughts about us that we don't understand, that we don't even expect them to have. How wild is that?